This episode contains real footage, real documents, and real experiments that were never meant to be made public until now. In the shadows of the Cold War, governments were afraid of ideas more than weapons, so they started building their own nightmares in laboratories, bunkers, and in mines. Acid tests, psychic soldiers, frequency manipulation. These weren't conspiracy theories. They were real and funded by your tax dollars. Some experiments left no survivors. Others left something worse. This is the story of the Cold War experiments that should have never happened, and the documents that prove that they did.
The United States Army in Europe.
The Cold War wasn't just a standoff between nations, it was a standoff between realities. Two superpowers, armed with nukes, spies, and unlimited funding, fought a war that was never officially declared. But make no mistake, it was very real.
The real threat to our security isn't the danger of bankruptcy, it is the danger of communist aggression. If communism is allowed to absorb the free nations one by one, then we would be isolated from our sources of supply and detached from our friends. Then we would have to take defense measures that might really bankrupt our economy and change our way of life so that we couldn't recognize it as American any longer. That's the very thing we're trying to keep from happening.
Between 1947 and 1991, the US and Soviet Union engaged in psychological warfare, arms races, and proxy conflicts. But some of their most disturbing battles didn't happen on the battlefield. They happened in laboratories, in locked rooms, in the human mind. The paranoia was total, the science was unregulated, and the goal was simple: control. What if you could control a soldier with sound? What if you could extract secrets through hypnosis? What if you could train someone to kill and forget they ever did it? These were not questions from science fiction. They were questions asked in actual US government memos, and the budgets behind them were classified. This wasn't just about spying. This was about redesigning the human mind to make it a weapon. In 1953, the CIA launched MK-Ultra, a classified project to weaponize the human mind. What began as national defense quickly unraveled into sanctioned psychological warfare. The mission: break a person's will, control their thoughts, create the perfect puppet. Its architect was Sidney Gottlieb, a government chemist with a fascination for poisons, psychedelics, and psychic control. He dosed civilians, prisoners, and even CIA agents with LSD, all without consent. The idea: if you could fracture someone's mind, maybe you could rebuild it from scratch. One of the first casualties was Dr. Frank Olson, a CIA biochemist that was drugged with LSD without his knowledge. 9 days later, he was dead, and his body found in the sidewalk beneath a Manhattan hotel.
One is either asked to believe that, in addition to being malicious in many ways, the CIA is very bumbling. But in this case, I think there's another possibility that there may have been some intent. And I'd like to be reassured that there was no intent to kill my father. I think that is an open question.
Eric believes his father didn't jump. Even future terrorist Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, was caught in MK Ultra's net. At 16, he was subjected to hours of stress-based interrogation. This was part of a secret psychological experiment at Harvard. He later wrote that it was the moment he stopped seeing people as human. But perhaps the darkest chapters from these experiments was the Subproject that was carried out not in the US, but Canada. Dr. Ewan Cameron, head of psychiatry at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, believed he could cure mental illness by erasing the mind and starting over. He called it depatterning.
They went there thinking that, they would be helped, little knowing that Dr. Cameron's goal was to depattern them, to wipe out their memory.
Marlene Levinson is speaking out for the first time to shed light on one of the darkest chapters of Canadian history. Her aunt was a victim of Dr. Ewan Cameron's brainwashing experiments used right here in Montreal at the Allen Memorial Institute.
Patients, many just suffering from anxiety or postpartum depression, were subjected to drug-induced comas lasting up to 30 days, extreme electroshock therapy at 20 to 40 times the recommended dose, and psychic driving. This is when one phrase is repeated over and over for hours, sometimes days.
Starting in the early 40s, Dr. Cameron used sleep-induced comas, massive doses of electroshock therapy, LSD, sensory deprivation, forcing patients to listen to hours of recorded messages on tapes. His goal? To control his patients' minds, to cure mental illness.
The results were catastrophic. Some forgot their names. Others lost the ability to read, write, even recognize their own children. None of them gave informed consent. All of it was funded by the CIA. MK Ultra was officially shut down in 1973, but most of its files were destroyed, shredded on orders from the CIA Director Richard Helms. What's left are fragments, court cases, and the lives it shattered. What's gone may be even darker. The following segment contains real documentation of experimental procedures that may disturb some viewers. It is presented for analysis only. Viewer discretion is advised. They called it progress. Others called it cruelty. Some even claimed it was fake. This wasn't just science. It was control over death, over mortality, over meaning. The Soviets didn't just test machines. They tested the line between life and the unthinkable. In 1940, the Soviet Union unveiled something that defied nature. A severed dog's head, disconnected from its body, but still alive. The head responded to sound, its eyes tracked movement, it even licked its lips. They said it was proof of life, but what it looked like was an experiment in reanimation. This was the work of Dr. Sergei Prokhenko, a Soviet scientist obsessed with life extension. His invention, the autojector, was a primitive heart-lung machine. It pushed blood and oxygen through severed arteries, kept tissues alive, restarted the irreversible. Officially, it was medical research, but unofficially, it was Soviet psychological warfare. Proof to the world and to the West that the USSR could cheat death, that even dismemberment couldn't silence their science. The footage was shown at international conferences. Some called it a hoax, others called it torture, but it was very real, and it didn't stop with dog heads. By the 1950s and 60s, the Soviets moved on to full-body transplants. Dogs with two heads, limbs sewn from one body to another. Some of them lived for days, some longer. These weren't experiments designed to save lives. They were designed to conquer them, push the edge of what the body and the mind could survive. What began as medical research became a rehearsal of what it means to be alive. Before the Cold War ever became a race for nukes and satellites, it was a war of ideologies. And in Soviet Russia, science wasn't about discovery, it was about control. Control over the body, control over life, control over death itself. The doghead experiments may have led to medical miracles, but they were born in a system that treated living beings as replaceable parts. And when you strip science of its ethics, what are you really left with? A cold machine, a twitching head, and a regime that wanted the world to watch. By the 1980s, the Cold War had reached a strange stalemate. Nuclear weapons hadn't broken the balance. Espionage had its limits. So the US turned to something else: psychics. What if the mind could cross borders, see through walls, spy on enemies from thousands of miles away with nothing but thought? It sounds like science fiction, but from 1978 to 1995, the US government poured over $20 million into a top-secret psychic spy unit. The codename was Project Stargate. Their mission: use remote viewing, the supposed psychic ability to see distant locations or objects to gather intelligence. And it wasn't just the CIA. The Army Intelligence and DIA were involved, and they weren't guessing. They kept score. In a sanitized room at Fort Meade, Maryland, military operatives sat blindfolded, given only coordinates. They drew targets, bunkers, people, weapons from memory that wasn't theirs. They claimed to see nuclear submarines, hostages in enemy territory, and secret Soviet labs. One of the most prolific remote viewers was Joseph McMoneagle, who claimed to accurately describe secret Soviet missile sites, downed planes, and even locations of hostages. And according to some declassified reports, he was right. Off enough to keep the program alive for nearly 20 years.
The Russians were using their psychics to target our congressmen, our senators, in hopes of driving up the anxiety, maybe producing a stroke or a heart attack.
But when you have the CIA, saying that, yes, we had Project Stargate, this is real, we had real psychics working.
They also said it never did any good for them. The problem with that statement is that they kept coming back to us for help for 23 years. They wanted to see if we could report on items that were huge distances away. Turned out it was very accurate. Remote viewing, if the more your ego's involved, the worse it gets. I've been doing this almost 50 years. In all the science behind it, we can't tell you how it works. Because that's when I looked up and there was a body half in and half out of the swinging door, and it was me. It's usually pretty easy to go into the past. And the reason why it's easy is because when you're in the past, you're seeing things that we have concepts for.
So have you gone back to look at how they were constructed?
Oh, yeah, that's an easy thing. Going into the future, whole different problem. The Department of Defense turns out to have sent people out to target these. I said, so what's the target? And I opened it. It said, Mars, 1 million BC.
Subjects were asked to sketch buildings thousands of miles away, places they'd never seen, under conditions they didn't understand. And sometimes the drawings matched reality. But the files get stranger. Some remote viewers were tasked with describing events on Mars. Others were told to locate submarines, observe nuclear sites, or spy on political targets in real time. To the public, it sounded ridiculous. But behind closed doors, they kept funding it. The official report claimed psychic spying had no value, but many insiders disagree. Some believe the program wasn't shut down, just renamed, buried, reclassified. After all, what better way to hide a successful spy tool than to convince the world it never worked? The 1950s were sold as America's golden age. Suburbs, schools, safety. But behind the curtain, the US government was using its own people as test subjects. In hospitals, prisons, and orphanages, civilians were injected with radioactive materials, often without their knowledge or consent. In one case, 829 pregnant women at Vanderbilt University were given what they were told were vitamin drinks, but they were radioactive iron cocktails. 7 of the children died. Many others developed cancer. The US Atomic Energy Commission partnered with elite hospitals and universities. The goal: study the effects of radiation on the human body without running clinical trials the legal way.
But then the side effects of the radiation will be the side effects of the cancer, and the Department of Defense wasn't particularly interested in the effects of radiation on people with metastatic cancer. They want us to know what the effects of radiation were on a healthy 23-year-old pilot. And that could be best studied by irradiating people whose cancers were not going to respond to the radiation. Most of the patients who were irradiated were poor. Most of the patients who were irradiated were African American. All of them had cancer. Some of them weren't all that sick. Some of them were still ambulatory. Some of them were still going to work. And the radiation had some pretty serious effects. Out of the 90 people who were irradiated, 21 of them were dead within a month.
In Philadelphia, prisoners were used to test everything from chemical weapons to radioactive isotopes. Some were offered a few dollars, others weren't told anything at all. One doctor, Albert Kligman, later said, "It was like a farmer seeing a field full of fertile soil." He was talking about prisoners. Even children weren't spared. At Fernald School in Massachusetts, boys with developmental disabilities were fed radioactive cereal as part of a science club sponsored by MIT and Quaker Oats. Let that sink in. For decades, these tests were buried, hidden in reports, masked as progress. But the truth leaked. In 1995, President Bill Clinton was forced to issue a public apology.
Thousands of government-sponsored experiments did take place at hospitals, universities, and military bases around our nation. The goal was to understand the effects of radiation exposure on the human body. While most of the tests were ethical by any standards, some were unethical, not only by today's standards, but by the standards of the time in which they were conducted. They failed both the test of our national values and the test of humanity. In one scientist injected plutonium into 18 patients without their knowledge. In another, doctors exposed indigent cancer patients to excessive doses of radiation, a treatment from which it is virtually impossible that they could ever benefit. The report also demonstrates that these and other experiments were carried out on precisely those citizens who count most on the government for its help, the destitute and the gravely ill. But the dispossessed were not alone. Members of the military, precisely those on whom we and our government count most, they were also test subjects. Informed consent means your doctor tells you the risk of the treatment you are about to undergo. In too many cases, informed consent was withheld. Americans were kept in the dark about the effects of what was being done to them. The deception extended beyond the test subjects themselves to encompass their families and the American people as a whole. For these experiments were kept secret, and they were shrouded not for a compelling reason of national security, but for the simple fear of embarrassment. And that was wrong.
But for thousands of Americans, the damage was already done. While MKUltra tested drugs in labs, another branch of the CIA took their experiments to the streets. It was called Operation Midnight Climax. In San Francisco and New York, CIA agents hired prostitutes to lure men into safe houses where they were dosed with LSD without their knowledge and recorded through two-way mirrors. They wanted to know how would people react when drugged. Would they confess secrets, commit crimes? Could sex and psychedelics become a weapon?
The Asians drank martinis behind the glass.
This was government-funded research, and no one was ever arrested. At Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland, from the 1950s to the 1970s, US soldiers were used as human guinea pigs. They were exposed to nerve agents, tear gas, LSD, PCP, and sarin gas, often with no idea what they were being given. One test involved BZ, a powerful hallucinogen designed to disorientate troops, but it could cause violent psychosis, seizures, and memory collapse. Edgewood was sold as national defense, but for many it became a life sentence of mental illness, paranoia, and trauma. Hidden in the remote edges of Japanese-occupied China was a facility where science and cruelty merged. It was called Unit 731, a covert biological and chemical warfare program run by Imperial Japan during World War II. Located in Manchuria, it was disguised as a water purification center, but its real purpose, live human experimentation.
苦しい声を上げてました。だから死んだ理由といえば、悶絶苦しんで、悶絶死ですね。
Victims were referred to as logs, a code to hide their humanity. They were men, women, children, civilians, and prisoners of war, used for grotesque tests. Doctors removed organs without anesthesia, froze limbs to study the effects of frostbite, infected victims with plague, cholera, syphilis, anthrax, and recorded every moment. They tested flamethrowers on live prisoners, placed people in pressure chambers until their eyes burst, injected horse urine into kidneys, all in the name of progress. Unit 731 was led by General Shiro Ishii, a man who viewed human lives as disposable research material.
彼はなぜ、細菌戦部隊というものを作ることを考えたかというと、ジュネーブ条約というものができてからまず化学兵器というのがあまりにも残酷であるということで、禁止されたと。それから細菌兵器についても同じように禁止されたと。そこに目をつけて、それだったら日本がその兵器を使ったらどんな戦争にも勝てるんじゃないかというふうに考えたわけです。
Here's the part the history books skip. After the war, the US discovered everything, and instead of prosecuting Ishii and his men, they made a deal. In exchange for the unit's data on biological warfare, the US gave them immunity. Some Unit 731 doctors even went to work in post-war Japanese hospitals. No one was ever charged. No one ever faced trial. The same doctors who mutilated children and designed plague bombs walked free with the backing of America. Because to the US military, the data was invaluable. They didn't see war crimes. They saw an opportunity, one that they had to get to before the Soviets. To this day, Japan's government has never formally acknowledged Unit 731's crimes. Most victims were Chinese, Korean, Russian, and they were silenced by history. Unit 731 wasn't a horror story. It was a real place, built by scientists, funded by generals, and covered up by governments. These weren't accidents. They weren't rogue operations. They were coordinated experiments, planned, funded, and carried out by governments that saw people as tools. Across oceans and ideologies, from Washington to Moscow to Manchuria, doctors, generals, and politicians reached for one impossible goal: control the mind, defy death, turn human beings into weapons. We only know about these programs because someone slipped up, because one file wasn't burned, one agent talked, someone's son asked questions. But how much more was erased? How many experiments are still hidden? Buried in redacted memos, deep inside military archives, or classified under names we haven't heard yet. Are these type of experiments going on today? If history has shown us anything, it's that the most horrific experiments don't always end when the programs do. These were just the ones we know about, the ones that slipped through the cracks. But what about the rest? The ones still buried, still hidden, still classified. Do you really think they stopped? Or are we just the next phase of the experiment? Let me know what you think. Are they still running experiments like this today?